Welcome, everybody. Hope everyone had a good weekend. I'm working for your exams. Take me a little while to get all those corrected. For class this week, we'll be covering Chapter 4, which has a lot to do with our lab on the bench press. So a lot of these concepts that you'll see in this chapter, you'll practice with calculations in the lab. So work, energy, and power. So building on Newton's 3 laws of motion. Remember, no class next Monday, so President's Day the 20th. So we won't have lab next week at all, but we will have lecture on Wednesday. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so work, power, and energy. Let's begin. So work is expressed in joules. So work is defined as energy that is transferred from one object or body to another object or body. So we see this all the time in sports and in physical conditioning, the transfer of energy from our bodies to an object or implement, such as throwing a baseball. To calculate work, we need to know two things. So first of all, we need the net force. And so that means there has to be an imbalance, and that means there has to be an acceleration. So a net force multiplied by displacement. So in order to have work, we have to have movement. So we have work with concentric muscle actions, where we're lifting things or opposing gravitational force. We have work with eccentric muscle actions, where we are producing tension but moving with gravity. Isometric actions wouldn't qualify in this case. So although with an isometric action, we're using ATP, which is chemical energy, this has to do with mechanical energy, so the expression of mechanical energy or energy transfer. So we have to have displacement in meters. So you want to remember that, because sometimes you're given the displacement in centimeters, and so to calculate work in joules, you'll need to convert that to meters. So that's exactly what we did in lab today with Limling. So you multiply 1 Newton and 1 meter together, and you get 1 Newton meter. And so 1 Newton meter is equal to 1 joule. So work and energy are both expressed in joules, Joule. And so we could say that when we apply a net force over a certain displacement, we have a change in mechanical energy of an object or body. So a wind-up that a pitcher goes through, we build force through the kinetic chain, and that wind-up takes place over a certain displacement. So the ball is physically undergoing a change in position through the course of the wind-up, and eventually releasing the ball with maximal velocity. So the ball undergoes a change in energy from prior to the wind-up to where the ball is released. So we do work on things to change mechanical energy. So weightlifting is a great example. In lab this week, we did a bench press test, and we measured limb length to assess work in joules. With free weights, the resistance is always in the direction of gravity. So weightlifting is a great way that you can apply the principle of work, because you're applying a net force, a net positive force to make the barbell go up in opposition to gravity. So you got the weight of the barbell, and you got the force from your muscles, and if your muscles produce more force than what the bar weighs, then you have a net positive force. So the bar goes up over a certain displacement until you reach the finished position of the lift. So this looks like a clean, so maybe the beginning phase of a clean and jerk. And so this is Vasily Alexeyev, not sure if But he was one of the greatest weightlifters in the heavyweight category of all time, won several gold medals from Russia. Okay, so we can do positive work, as in concentric muscle actions. With positive work, the net force and the displacement are in the same direction. So think about winning an arm wrestling match, as Sylvester Stallone there is beating Bull Hurley. How many have seen this movie from 1986? No? Oh, you're missing out. 1986, over the top, great movie. So, winning an arm wrestling match, force and displacement are in the same direction, right? See? We can also have the opposite of that, negative work, eccentric muscle actions in which force and displacement are in opposite directions. So, Bull Hurley in this case, which direction is he pulling? So he's pulling in the opposite direction from where his opponent is moving his arm. So force and displacement are in opposite directions. So think about that in the context of, say, in lab today with a bench press. When you allow the bar to come down to your chest, what direction are you applying force to the bar? Even when the bar is coming down. Yeah, you're still applying an upward force to the bar. It's just less than what? Yeah, the bar itself. So it's a competition, right, between the weight of the bar and the force, the summation of force from your muscles applied through your hands to the bar. So you're still applying an upward force to the bar, but not sufficient to overcome the weight of the bar. So the bar is coming down in opposition to the direction of force. And then on the way up, it's the opposite scenario. So lifting weight, the summation of force from your muscles is greater than the weight, so the weight goes up. And so the force and displacement are in the same direction. So do you have any questions on that? So does everybody understand the difference between positive and negative work? So let's take a step further into this, because there's lots of sports applications. So a wind-up or backswing. So a backswing in golf, or a wind-up in fast-pitch softball or baseball. Why are these things important? So we could even take into account concepts from chapter 3 in terms of impulse. Impulse is equal to what two things multiplied together? Remember? You've got a net force, and it's not displacement with impulse, it's time. So impulse and work are very similar, right? Because we have a net force applied over a time period with impulse, and with work we have a net force applied over a displacement. So if you have displacement or moving going on, there's time that is passing. So if you're doing work on an object or body, there's also an impulse there as well, because time is passing as displacement is going on. So a wind-up allows more time or more displacement for the net force to build up or accumulate. So you're involving multiple segments of the kinetic chain, more than just your arm, and the more time or the more displacement allows the net force to be higher at the point of release. So from an injury prevention standpoint, let's look at negative work now. Negative work. So after the ball is released, in this case, the ball is released. Does the arm immediately come to a halt once the pitcher lets go? Obviously not. So we have the arm slowing down over a given time period or over a given displacement, right? So there's negative impulse or negative work going on during the follow-through. So follow-through, the injury prevention aspect comes in when we're trying to minimize the average net force that the shoulder is subjected to. So the lab last week, what was the trend you found as the time to become stable went up, what happened to the average force generally? It went down. So it's the same concept with throwing in this case. We're trying to safely bring the arm to a stop, and so taking more time to do that lowers the average force that the shoulder capsule is subjected to with those ligaments. So that's why muscle training is so important. So muscles protect joints. Okay, so third point here. Most major league pitchers tend to be taller, rather, and longer limbed than other players. How could this be an advantage in pitching? How many remember Randy Johnson? Played for the Arizona Diamondbacks. How tall was he? He's like really tall. Yeah, 6'10", and just intimidation. How many of you have ever seen the clip where he was pitching and a bird flew right through the path right at that moment the ball was coming towards the plate and just explode? You'll have to look that up. That's just how many, I mean, a millisecond later and the bird would have been fine. But with reference to work, why is that an advantage to be taller and have long limbs? Yeah, okay, so we're able to apply that force over a longer displacement before the ball is released. So that means that much more velocity if we can apply net force over a little bit more displacement. Okay, so negatives, force and displacement in opposite directions. So negatives is kind of a concept that is involved with weight training. Okay, so sometimes you would load the bar with heavier weight than what you can lift, and then you have someone there to help you with the positive part, and then you're just doing the lowering part. So you're pushing upwards on the bar, but not with sufficient force to keep the bar from coming down. And so more than your concentric one repetition maximum. So most 1 rep max tests are tests of concentric strength. So rarely will you see a test of maximum eccentric strength because it's hard to really judge when you would lose control and the bar would just be dropping without any muscle force. So under more controlled conditions with isokinetic machines, we can measure force during eccentric actions. Here's one particular lit review from about 5 years ago, 2018, that looked at eccentric actions in particular. Came to the conclusion that we are 30 to 70% stronger in eccentric muscle actions. So if you've had exercise phys, then you probably studied that little tiny protein that is called titin. Isn't that a great name for a protein, titin, in your muscle cells that accounts for this strength increase above concentric actions? So what that says is with traditional strength training, we are not getting a whole lot out of the eccentric phase. So if the concentric phase is really, really difficult, the eccentric phase is going to be more submaximal. So think about a 1 rep max test. It's not the eccentric phase that creates the problem. It's the concentric part. It's not lowering the weight that is the max. It's the lifting the weight that is the max. So from a practical application, pull-ups, one of the hardest exercises in the gym, from my perspective. One of the hardest exercises to get really, really good at. You have to do them a lot. You can start just by doing negatives and taking advantage of your strength, and then once you're able to do lots of negatives, then maybe go to holds where you're holding, and then maybe transitioning into some full range where you're lifting and lowering. So helps to kind of build up to the full pull-up. So this is kind of a good image that I found that kind of describes this concept of being able to lower a lot more weight than what you can lift. So wouldn't it be great if you could, and I've actually seen this now where you can hook, there's things that are purposely made to have the eccentric phase be a lot more difficult. So you can look at these things. It's really interesting. It's a pin loaded or a plate loaded device that you can hook over each end of the barbell, and then you lower it, and it automatically unloads at the bottom position, and then you can lift back up. The problem is you can't put it back on for a second repetition. You have to have somebody there to. So there are practitioners that are really thinking of creative ways to maximize this. You can even have somebody apply extra pressure to the bar and then remove the pressure for the lift part. So there's ways that you can make your training more effective with the eccentric actions. Okay, so practical problem. Again, these are just for the purpose of helping you prepare for exams. So very simple. A therapist is helping a patient do a PNF hamstring stretch. What does PNF stand for? So we're all on the same page. Proprioceptors, right? Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. So we're manipulating the Golgi tendon organ, which elicits relaxation of the muscle being stretched. So the idea is you take a muscle to the limit of its range of motion. So this would be a supine hamstring stretch. And then you ask the person being stretched to push against you. So push in the opposite direction. It can either be isometric or dynamic. So in this case, he pushes on the patient's foot with a force of 200 newtons. So that's in one direction, that's positive. The patient resists the force and moves the foot negative 20 centimeters in the opposite direction towards the therapist. So contracting the hamstrings to extend the hip in the opposite direction. How much work was done during the stretching exercise? So we've got force and we've got displacement. What do you have to do to the centimeters? Yeah, so you just move it over to the left 2, and so now you've got negative 0.2 meters, and so now you multiply those two together, 200 times negative 0.2, and so you get, what, 40 like that? So 40 joules, negative 40 joules of work. Okay. All right, so range of motion, really, really important in strength training. Particularly if you look at research on squatting, the most gains in strength, in power, and in hypertrophy come with full range of motion. This is extreme, what you see here. This is not what we would expect everybody to be able to do based on anatomy, ankle mobility, hip mobility, but I believe everyone should at least be able to do a squat where the tops of the thighs are parallel with the ground. That should be the bottom point for most people. If you like Olympic weightlifting and you want to do that as a sport, then you have to really learn to handle weight in these extreme parts of the movement, because how many of you have ever tested a 1 rep max on a clean, right? Where are you catching that weight when it gets heavy? You're catching it in this deep position, and then what do you have to do once you catch it? You got to stand up with it. That's tough. Tough to do. So encouraging development of hip mobility and ankle mobility especially. A lot of people don't realize that being able to squat deep comes from being able to get good dorsiflexion in your ankles, being able to have a little bit of rotation at the knee joint. So the knee joint not only flexes and extends, but it also has a little bit of rotation there, which is really important to be able to get down between your feet into that bottom position. So found a good link for you, Brett Contreras. How many have heard of him or seen his stuff online? I've published one study with him, but he gives a really good practical-oriented lecture on how to find your perfect squat depth. Because this isn't the perfect depth for everybody, but he helps identify how can we improve to the point where we're getting down at least to parallel. So let's go ahead and
to teach you how to determine your ideal squat depth. So, go to any commercial gym, you'll typically see guys loading up, 5 plates on each side and going down to here. That's called a quarter squat. That is not ideal for building hypertrophy. Several studies show that even though you're using lighter weight, when you squat deep, you build your quad mass and hamstring mass to a greater degree. So you want to squat deep. The problem is, not everyone can do a rock bottom squat. Let me tell you about an important study that looked at 200 subjects. This was a huge study involving 200 people. They looked at hip range of motion. So this is called hip flexion mobility, right? Hip flexion range of motion. And what they found was there was a huge range between subjects. So the people with the worst hip mobility had 80 degrees. The people with the best had 140 degrees. So let me take Skelly here and show you what this looks like. So, this is Skelly. 80 degrees, so 90 degrees is a right angle, right? Now, 80 degrees is going to be like right here. So if you can imagine, you try to set Skelly up in a squat. Skelly can't even squat to parallel, not even close. This is 80 degrees right here. So the people with really poor hip mobility can get to right here. If they go any deeper than this, watch what's going to happen. The hip can't go any deeper. The hip stops right here. Now, it's important that you know why it stops. It stops because of how the head of the femur interacts with the hip socket, the acetabulum. How this fits into the ball and socket joint, all right? It'll typically, the head of the femur will hit. It hits the ridge of the acetabulum right here. It can't go any deeper. So if you go deeper, you can't go deeper, but it's not going to be achieved through greater hip flexion because it hits right here. So how do you get deeper? You tilt the pelvis posteriorly and you flex the lumbar spine. It looks like this. This is bad. This can create disc herniations and ligament injuries. You don't want that. You want to keep the spine stable in neutral position. You want to keep that arch. You don't want to lose it. So, how much is needed to go rock bottom? As you can see here, for Skelly to do a rock bottom squat, that's about 140 degrees of hip flexion. And not many people have that. So how do people go hit rock bottom? Most people will, say top out around here, and they will flex a little bit. There is some wiggle room with butt wink. Okay, butt wink is where you tilt the pelvis rearward and flex the lumbar spine. A little bit is okay, too much will hurt you. If you're like me and you want to be squatting for a lot of decades to come, then you really want to pay attention to this. So let me teach you how to determine your ideal squat depth. All right, I'm going to get next to, I'm going to use a squat rack. I'm going to use the bar here for support. And I'm just going to get down like this, okay? Now, it is important to stay on the heels, because that's how you're going to squat in real life. You don't want to come up on your toes. As you can see here, I can achieve a nice rock bottom squat if I come up on my toes. But that's poor squatting mechanics. So get down on your heels. And now use this bar for balance. And just relax. Relax everything. So this would be a really crappy squat, right? I wouldn't want to squat like that because look at how rounded my spine is. So I'm going to use my spinal erectors to keep an arch in the spine, right? So what do I have to do here? As I get the arch, you're going to watch my hips raise up. So, arch, 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 arch. using my erectors, all right? And then I get to about right here, okay? Make sure you're leaning forward. If you let go of this and you fall backwards, that's not characteristic of a real squat. In a real squat, you lean forward a little bit to keep your balance, okay? So right here, this is as deep as I can go. It's below parallel, but it's not ass to grass. I can't squat ass to grass. This is as deep as I can go. I'm keeping a nice arch in my spine and pelvis. This right here is a good squat form for me. If I go deeper than this, watch what I have to do. Round the spine, okay? It's not good, okay? So I want to stay right here. This is good for me. Now, notice that I need a lot of ankle dorsiflexion here to achieve this squat depth. So sometimes squat depth can be limited by ankle dorsiflexion. And you'll see some guys, like Olympic weightlifters, for example, they will wear Olympic shoes that give them some heel. Some people will squat with their heels on plates or boards. What this does is give you artificial ankle dorsiflexion mobility so you can stay more upright. And that's one solution for people who have poor ankle dorsiflexion mobility. But watch here if I don't. Let's say I only had this much ankle dorsiflexion mobility right here. All right? Then see my squat is rounded because I can't go to here. So if this is all I had, how would I determine my ideal squat depth with this amount of ankle dorsiflexion mobility? I'd have to come up, come up, come up, come up.
So you have an ankle
Right here.
dorsiflexion is connected to your depth.
So I just showed you how poor ankle dorsiflexion limits squat depth as well. So you are very limited in squat depth. What can you do? Because most of it is determined by hip anatomy and then your ankle flexibility. There's only so much you can do, but you can improve it. So here's the ways to improve it. Number one, you can work on increasing your ankle dorsiflexion mobility. Things you can do for that are calf stretches, stretching the calves. You can also kind of go like this and lean in. You feel that stretch in here, okay? You can also just get into a squat position using a bar and lean to one side. I'm going to pick this ankle,
It's stuff you can do every single day.
push, feel that stretch back in here. Then I'll shift to this side and do the same. What I like about this way of stretching is you can work on hip mobility at the same time. So I'm kind of balancing a little, I can squirm a little straight, and I can work on getting my hips loose, and getting my hips deeper, in addition to getting my ankles as well. So just doing this and kind of, squirming and wiggling, and you can build ankle and hip mobility this way. But you can also increase your squat depth by learning how to use your glutes. Let me show you why. We'll bring Skelly back here. And the glutes right here, what they do is they pull rearward on the femur. So if you don't use your glutes, it's going to migrate forward a little bit in the socket, and it's going to cause this to hit the ridge faster. If the glutes are pulling rearward, it creates a little bit of room for you to go a little bit deeper. And this is why when people learn how to use their glutes, through glute activation drills and through proper squat technique, they will tell you that they get deeper with a squat over time. Okay? Does hamstring stretching always work? Well, think about this. As I go down into a squat, if my legs stayed straight and I went into hip flexion, this lengthens the hamstring. But as you go down into squat, your hip moves into flexion, but your knee moves into flexion. So it shortens at the knee and lengthens at the hip. So is hamstring mobility limiting squat depth? You can a little bit if you're having a big forward tilt of the spine around the pelvis, because anterior tilt, but not much. Generally speaking, the hamstrings don't change a ton of length in the squat because the knee and hip are moving at the same time. So don't think that just stretching your hamstrings will improve your squat depth. Again, work on increasing your ankle dorsiflexion mobility, your hip flexion mobility, and then your glute activation. All right, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much.
Okay, so ankle dorsal flexion, right? So we can modify that. Hip flexion mobility, we can modify that, but we get a little more out of hip flexion mobility if we can strengthen our glutes, because they pull backwards on the femoral head. So with the femoral head rotating within the acetabulum, the head is not going to hit up against the acetabular rim as soon as if we're pulling back on it with strong glutes. So we can do glute activation drills such as hip thrusts, which is a big one, as well as other things to target the glutes. So hamstring flexibility, if that was interesting, is not really a limiter for squat depth, because the hamstrings really don't change in length going from the top to the bottom. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about work. So Bryn and Jordan, evolution of shot put technique. Did you know that it used to look like this to start? And this was around the early 1900s, I think. So they would hop across the circle on this foot and then release. And now, of course, evolution of technique, and now it starts this way, so you're actually facing opposite to the direction of throw. So how does this relate to work, force times displacement, or the impulse concept, force times time?
So it gives you more time because you're having to turn all the way
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, so there's a greater time or displacement over which we can build this net force prior to release, because you're in a confined space, right? So you have to make the most of what you can do within that limited space. And so the evolution of technique obviously has, I think there was a world record, maybe summer of 2021 at the US trials. Maybe you saw that with the men. I remember seeing it and being aware of it, but it was just so impressive to watch how we put that out there. Okay, so energy is the capacity to do work. So work is defined as energy transfer from one object or system to another, whereas energy is the capacity to do work. So work and energy are intertwined with each other. The more work you do, the more energy expressed through a body or object. So we have a couple different types of energy that are relevant to mechanics. First one is potential energy. So potential energy has two types. The first one is strain potential. So what do you think of when you think of an object or body that's under strain? So I think of muscles and tendons that can stretch and store energy. So in a way, muscles, the musculotendinous unit is like a rubber band. So it can stretch and store energy, and then it can release energy. So stretch, shorten, cycle, right? So strain potential energy is equal to 1/2 kx squared. So K is equal to the stiffness of the material. So can our musculotendinous unit vary in stiffness? Yeah, so we see that all the time. If we're doing the sit and reach test with a box, we want more compliance, right? So we want to be in a state where the musculotendinous units are compliant. And so they're able to give a little bit more versus going into a flexibility test with no warm-up where there's greater amounts of stiffness. So that's the objective with flexibility testing. What about if our objective is to jump really high or run really fast? Wouldn't we want a musculotendinous unit that has more stiffness or more rebound, right? So the direction is now that we don't want to do excessive amounts of static stretching before jumps and sprints, because we take all the stiffness away from the musculotendinous unit. So the specific work on flexibility And lengthening of the musculotendinous unit takes place after workouts or on active rest days. So X is the amount of stretch. So how many of you use bands for different things? Yes, they're very popular. Bands that come in different colors. Why do we have different colors? Yeah, there was resistance, or we could say certain colors have greater stiffness, right? So they're more resistant to stretch, is another way of describing stiffness, is resistance to being stretched or lengthened. And so you take a band that has a lot of resistance to stretch combined with stretching it a lot, and that's going to give you a lot of strain potential energy expressed through that material. So in practice, we can use these, of course, for all kinds of different things, and they're very inexpensive, so they make good tools because you can do a lot of things with them, and it doesn't really cost a lot compared with some of the other free weight type equipment. Okay, so just more of the same. How many have done this stretch? Here. So this is kind of a hip mobilization to increase flexibility of the hip flexors. And so this band is tied to an upright here and then placed around the left leg just below the hip. And so this forces activation of the glutes, because the glutes are hip extensors. So to keep the left leg in an extended position requires that the glutes are activated. Now this is really good if you want to increase flexibility of the hip flexors on the opposite side, because there's this neurological concept called reciprocal inhibition. So it says that if you activate a muscle on one side of a joint, such as the gluteus maximus, that the muscles that are in opposition, such as the hip flexors, will then relax. So if you really want to get a good deep hip flexor stretch, if you find you have really tight hip flexors, then this is a really good way to do it, because you can manipulate the nervous system by forcing your glutes to activate really strong, and then that reciprocally inhibits the hip flexors. So that's what you want. You want those hip flexors to relax or be inhibited to get them more flexible. So a few different variations there that you can do with bands. Okay, so pole vaulting. How many have watched these crazy athletes? I have one of my daughters. I have 3 daughters and 1 son. My middle daughter, Audrey, is a pole vaulter in high school now. And so she's working hard to get up to that opening height. So opening height is 6 feet. So she was close last year, and she just hit it with one of her feet, and it fell off. But I was just hoping for her, and as you'll find out one day when you're a parent how much you ache for your kids to have success. But at any rate, the material that goes into the pole has changed. So we start with ash, and then we went to bamboo, aluminum, and then now we're with these fiberglass poles that contain resin around a metal pole shaft to produce a slightly curved pole that bends more easily under compression. And so that's going to transfer more energy into the athlete. That's going to throw them up, hopefully high enough to clear the bar. So there's a nice 3-minute lecture on the science of pole vaulting here. So let's take a look at that one.
Performance technique analyst, work for High Performance Sport New Zealand, but focusing always with New Zealand athletics and predominantly the pole vault squad. So some of the athletes we've got in the pole vault squad here are Eliza McCartney, who's the bronze medalist from the Rio Olympic Games, Nick Southgate, Olivia McTaggart, and Imogen Iris. So we're going to have a look at Imogen's footage. So she's one of our younger pole vaulters who's going to be going to the World Junior Champs coming up very soon. So she's kind of come in at a younger age, is kind of working up as part of this squad with Eliza, with the coach, Jeremy McCall. So the pole vault's kind of the unique event in that it's kind of combining athletic speed with also the gymnastic ability of getting over the bar. So the first initial stage of the pole vault is the run-up. So athletes will choose a run-up. They can either go full run-up to be something like 16 steps, so that could be 40 meters out, Shorter run-ups, they might only go off 10 steps, but the main aim of that run-up is to generate as much velocity as possible, transferring into the bolt. So the purpose of the pole vault is to convert that kinetic energy from the approach into the vertical energy to get over the bar.
Kinetic energy.
All the jumps in track and field use this system. Most though would lose energy as they convert it to the vertical energy. The pole vault is kind of unique in it has the additional benefit of the strain energy, so the elastic energy in the pole. So the athlete can actually increase the amount of energy stored, which is how they're able to jump kind of these 5-meter heights. So they have the run up to develop the maximum velocity, and then that takeoff point is really important. So athletes will take off approximately between 3.5, 4 meters back from the box, and they'll plant the pole, and then using force just through that left leg takeoff, or right leg, generate that vertical velocity, which then elevates them into the air. The takeoff is a really quick phase where they've got to concentrate on planting the pole, generating the vertical force, and then taking off. The maximum pole bend will occur just after takeoff, so they call that the C position, and that's where the athlete is using all their upper body muscular strength to exert as much bend on the pole. So that helps store elastic energy in the pole, which then when the pole straightens, that returns that energy to the athlete and enables them to elevate up in the air. So the poles are all made of a fiberglass material, like traditionally in the olden days they're made from wood. They're now progressed to be made from fiberglass and carbon fibre, and this is really good for, it keeps them light, but it also means they can store that energy when they're being bent. An athlete will typically actually take between 9 to 10 poles to a competition, all of different lengths and then of different flex ratings. And based on the height that the bar is at, they'll change the pole they're using. So they may go to a stiffer pole later in competition to help them reach those higher heights. The best thing for the athlete to do is that after that point, when the pole is straightening and returning the energy, the athlete needs to try and stay as close to the pole as possible. So they'll try and keep their body upright, so they're going feet first up in the air, staying close to the pole so that they're not losing energy either way. Trying to keep their legs as close together as possible. And then when they reach that maximum height, the aim is to bend their body over the bar. So this is very similar to the Fosbury flop technique in high jump. That if they can bend their body, this actually allows their centre of mass to pass underneath the bar. So the centre of mass then actually lies outside the body, and they can orientate their body over the bar. And then the most important thing is then releasing the pole back so that the pole doesn't knock over the bar at the top.
I think the key there is the transfer of kinetic to potential energy. Okay, so we have two different types of potential energy. So strain potential energy, so the energy that you can see when a pole vault pole bends, but we also have what's called gravitational potential energy. So rather than being dependent on stiffness and how much something bends, this is dependent on height, usually height above the ground. So energy is a scalar quantity, so we just want to know magnitude. So whenever you're calculating gravitational potential energy, rather than using negative 9.81, you'll just use 9.81 for that calculation. So mass and then gravitational acceleration, positive 9.81 meters per second squared, and then the height above the ground. So energy in joules, whether it's strain or gravitational, is still joules, is the unit to use. Okay, so lastly we have kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So one of the things that was discussed there is you have to generate a lot of horizontal velocity. So most athletes that are good pole vaulters, and I need to study up on that, but I'm assuming they're pretty fast, because you want to transfer all the velocity that you gain on the approach into the vault itself. So the more velocity you can generate, the more kinetic energy you can generate, the more energy you have to transfer into potential energy during the flight phase. So mass and then velocity. So you can think of an inverse relationship between potential energy and kinetic energy. So as an object or body increases in speed and decreases in height, it's going to have less gravitational potential energy, and more kinetic energy. So we see here in this simple example of ski jumping, at the top of the hill, kinetic energy is 0 because we don't have any movement. So we have to have velocity to have kinetic energy. Whereas we have the maximal amount of potential energy, gravitational potential energy, because it's equal to mass multiplied by gravity multiplied by the height above the ground. So height above the ground would be the key factor. Okay, so if we have 50,000 joules of total energy, it's going to transition between different types. So halfway down the hill, we've started to generate velocity, and we're reducing height. So now some of that 50,000 is distributed into kinetic, and then we've lost some potential because we are closer to the ground. Okay, so at the bottom of the jump, you can see here 35,000 because we've increased velocity, continue to increase velocity, and then we're even closer to the ground. Still, the total is equal to 50,000. And then as the jump is in the midpoint here, we can see the height halfway down the hill, and at the peak of the flight is the same because of velocity and height above the ground. So this is just kind of a simple concept showing the transition between energy. And then with the landing, we're now on the ground, so potential energy is 0. We're still moving to slow down the landing, and so that's 50,000 on kinetic energy. Okay. All right, so practice problem. Shayna is pole vaulting. So at the end of her approach run, she has a horizontal velocity of 8 meters per second. So it's pretty fast. And her center of mass is 1 meter high off the ground. So at the end of her approach, just before she plants the pole and rises off the ground, she has some kinetic energy. So she has an initial amount of kinetic energy because she has velocity. She also has an initial amount of potential energy because her center of mass is 1 meter high off the ground during that approach. So if we're considering the center of mass as, and then the ground is the reference point, then she does have some initial potential energy. So if Shayna's mass is 60 kilograms, estimate how high she should be able to vault if all her initial kinetic energy and initial potential energy, so initial potential, initial kinetic, are converted to her final potential energy. So we're hoping that that height above the ground is sufficient to clear the bar. So we're estimating the height. It's not the height of the pole or the height of the bar is not given to you here, but we're estimating how high she should go given the initial conditions. So let's work through this together. So I write on your paper PEF, so that's your final potential energy, is equal to your initial potential energy plus your initial kinetic energy. So remember, 8 meters per second, 1 meter initially, and then 60 kilograms. So I'm going to open up our whiteboard here. All right, so let's do this. So P E F is equal to P potential energy initial plus kinetic energy initial. So potential energy is equal to mass. What's the mass? 60. Yeah, so 60 kilograms multiplied by gravity. So again, use positive because energy is scalar multiplied by height. Now, with height, I'm just going to put an h with a subscript f. So we'll be solving for that. And then your PEI, we can say, okay, so that's 60 multiplied by 9.81. What's her initial height? Remember? Yeah. 1.0 meters plus your initial kinetic energy. So final kinetic energy, why don't we have to consider that? At the peak of her flight, what's her final kinetic energy going to be? She's not going up anymore, she's not coming down, so yeah, so it'll be 0 at that instance. Our assumption. So kinetic energy 1/2 mass times, what's our velocity? Yeah. 8 meters per second. And we've got to square that, right? Okay, so there's our problem. Now, if I want to solve just for HF, what have I got to do with these things?
Divide them over.
Yeah, so I could, let's do that. We'll do that in just a moment. How about we solve for this to start off with? So, you know, with energy, you're going to get joules. It's not important that you know that kilogram meters per meter squared, second squared. Just know that it's joules. So 60 times 9.81 times 1, how many joules of energy do you have? Any decimal part of that?
0.6.
Okay, let's okay, plus, so 8 squared is 64 times 60 divided by 2 is, what'd you get? Quite a bit of 1,000 something.
920.
1,920 joules. Okay. All right, so then you can add these together, and what do you get?
$2,508.6.
2,000.
508.6.
2,508.
Yes. 0.6.
6, okay, joules. Okay, so over here, what's 60 kilograms times 9.81?
580.
Yeah, so this is equal to 588.6 multiplied by your final height. Okay, the units here is kilograms, meters per second squared, but eventually it's all going to end up in meters because you're dividing the joules out of it, so. So then you divide this side by 588.6. So what is your final height? Should be 4.26 meters is your final height there. So, do you have any questions on that one? Pretty just understanding the final versus the initial. And let's talk about stretch, shorten cycle. So we've covered this in a few other classes. Let's talk about the mechanics of it. So there's two parts, a stretch and a shorten. So we're talking about muscles and primarily tendons. So tendons are like the springs of the body. So tendons can have varying amounts of stiffness depending on their initial state when a muscle contracts. So there's several different phrases that I associate with each of these parts. So a tendon stretches and then a tendon recoils. So we store energy within a tendon and then we release it. So strain energy is what we store. Remember, stiffness multiplied by how much you stretch it. And then we release it during the subsequent contraction. So practically speaking, we have high-speed eccentric action. So think of a depth jump where you step off of a box and you rapidly decelerate your body, which is a high-speed eccentric action, and then you rapidly accelerate your body in the opposite direction. So that's a high-speed concentric action. And so a couple more phrases: jump loading and jump takeoff. So stretch and the shorten. So there's a phase in here. This will be a test question, so you want to remember that word. Amortization is the short time interval between when the stretch ends and when the shorten begins. So there's a time interval over which we have the opportunity to use the energy that we store during the stretch. So if this amortization is too long, the energy converts from strain energy to heat energy. And so we're not able to utilize the energy that we store in the subsequent contraction. So over time, we find that with jump training, this time interval tends to shorten. So we get better at being able to use the strain energy, putting it into the jump part of the contraction part. So very critical, the amortization phase, the connection between these two has to be as short as possible. So the load into the contraction allows us to put more energy into the jump. So putting it all together the right way, anybody know who this is? Yes, 1986 NBA Slam Dunk champion. He was 5'6" and had a really good vertical jump. And yeah, 5'6" and won the NBA Slam Dunk competition. So pretty impressive. So I watched a recent YouTube video where he's in his close to 60 now, but in his 40s he could still dunk, which is pretty impressive. Okay, so work-energy relationship. This is very similar to the impulse-momentum relationship. So work, force times displacement equals a change in energy. Impulse, force over a time period equals a change in momentum. It's really the same thing, because if you have a change in energy, especially kinetic energy where there's velocity, you're going to have a change in momentum. So just as we can apply an impulse to increase or decrease momentum, in the same way we can do work to increase energy expressed through an object or body, or we can do work, force over a displacement, to decrease the energy that's expressed through an object or body. So the equation is similar to what we had with impulse momentum, where it was force times time equals change in momentum, mass times velocity. With work energy, it's force over a displacement to either increase or decrease energy. So let's take baseball, for example. So a pitcher exerts an average horizontal force of 100 newtons on a 0.15 kilogram baseball. So you have force applied to a baseball that has a mass of 0.15 kilograms his hand and ball move through the horizontal displacement of 1.5 meters. So you've got force and displacement that acts to change the kinetic energy of the ball. So at the start of the windup, the kinetic energy of the ball is going to be equal to 0 because it has no velocity. So this is really looking at the final kinetic energy of the ball at this point. So force multiplied by displacement, so 100 times 1.5 will give you the amount of work that changes the energy of the ball. So what's kinetic energy equal to? 1/2 what? What is it? 1/2, yeah, 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So we have force times displacement, and then because the initial kinetic energy is equal to 0 because we have 0 velocity, we're looking at final kinetic energy, so that equals 1/2 times velocity squared. So 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So we have 100 newtons. And what was our displacement?
1.5.
1.5 meters. Okay. And so we can divide that by 1/2 of our mass, which is 0.15 kilograms, to get velocity squared. So what do we need to do to get velocity all by itself? Yeah, so you can just solve that whole thing, take the square root. What do you get for velocity in meters per second? Should be coming up with something like that. 44.7 meters per second, which is, that's almost exactly 100 miles per hour. Everybody getting 44.7? Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're getting down to the end here. We're almost there. Hang in there. Okay, so the next concept is power. So what's the difference between power and work? Well, work is moving an object or body from point A to point B. So you apply a net force over a certain displacement. Doesn't matter how fast you do it. So power is different. It's how fast you do work. So if work is equal to force times displacement, you divide that by time, you get power in watts. So this is really important. So in lab, we not only assessed how many times you could move a bar from point A to point B, but we also assessed how fast in terms of velocity. So the tendo cord that you hook to the barbell assesses velocity. So you can also break this down into force multiplied by displacement divided by time, which we've already know from chapter 2 is velocity. So in summary, power is equal to force times velocity. So if you know the force in newtons, so in lab we know what the barbell was in newtons, and then we measured what the velocity was for each repetition, so you can estimate power from those two measures, from force and velocity. So power is the rate of doing work per unit time. So looking at this curve, we can see a relationship between force and velocity and power, so all three. So if we have velocity on the y-axis, and we have force on the x-axis, so force and velocity, it turns out that peak power happens at about 1/3 or 0.3, 1/3 of maximal force and velocity. So practically speaking, we get peak power at submaximal force and submaximal velocity together. So if power is equal to force times velocity, each of those is important to generate peak power. So that the practical application is we generate peak power with submaximal amounts of weight that are moved with maximal volitional velocity. So as fast as we can move a submaximal amount of weight is where we get our peak power. So if we lift loads that are close to our 1 rep max, so in other words, if force is getting out here to where we're getting close to our 1 rep max, what's going to happen to velocity? What's your velocity like with a really heavy amount of weight? You might be able to lift the weight, which is great if it's about work, but the time that you're able to do it is not going to be very much. So there's a balance between the two. So practically speaking, a lot of research, it's 1/3 maximal force and velocity. So we could say 30% of a 1 rep max theoretically is where you're going to get your peak power. So if your maximal force is, say, 100% of your 1 rep max, then we can say, okay, if we know that, then we're going to get 30% of 1 rep max, and that's where the peak power value is going to be. So that's the application. So more on the application, if we look at the force velocity curve in terms of the percentage of 1 rep max, so you go from 0 all the way to 100% of 1 rep max, and then you have velocities out here. So your maximal strength, your 1 rep maxes are going to be here, but the velocity is really slow. So then as we go down here, emphasizing strength or absolute force, our Olympic lifts, where submaximal loads that are moved quickly, we're starting to get into higher velocities, speed strength, plyometrics, where it's our body mass that's moved quickly, and then ultimately where it's just an unloaded body weight type sprinting or agility drills. This is where you're getting your maximal velocity, but what's absolute force like? And you're over here. Absolute force is going to be here. So a very low percentage of our 1 rep max in absolute terms, but that's where you're getting your maximal velocity. So overall, you want right in the middle of the force velocity curve where you have some force and some velocity. That's where your power is going to be the strongest, is right in there with a little bit of force and a little bit of velocity together. Okay, so Lydia snatched 100 kilograms. In a snatch, the barbell is moved from a stationary position on the floor to over the athlete's head. Only 0.5 seconds elapsed from the first movement of the barbell until it was overhead. So wow, from the ground all the way overhead to the catch, 0.5 seconds. And the barbell moved through a vertical displacement of 2 meters. What was Lydia's power output during the lift? So again, power is a scalar quantity, so we use positive instead of negative 9.81. So how do we convert 100 kilograms into newtons to start off with? How do we convert any mass into newtons? Multiplied by, yeah, so 100 multiplied by 9.81 is 981 newtons. So to get work, we multiply newtons by what? So 981 newtons multiplied by a displacement of 2. That'll give you your work, but for power, we want to know how fast the work was done. So 981 newtons multiplied by 2 gives you your work, and then you divide that by your time of 0.5 seconds. That's going to give you a huge power output, somewhere over 3,000 watts. So watts, Newton meters per second is expressed in watts, mechanical watts. So Olympic weightlifters have the highest power outputs because they're moving large amounts of weight over large displacements in very little amount of time. So what was your exact answer? It's almost 4,000 watts, which is definitely realistic for an elite Olympic weightlifter. So does everybody understand how we went from mass to newtons and then multiply by displacement, divide by time? Okay. Okay, very last one for the day, and then we're done. So vertical jump and reach. So you're comparing two athletes on their power output. So they're moving their body mass during the course of a vertical jump. John is 80 kilograms, so that's like 175 pounds, and jumps 60 centimeters. So what do we have to do to centimeters? Yeah, so it's going to be 0.6 meters, just like we did with limb length in lab today. While Sam is 100 kilograms, okay, so 220 pounds, that's big, especially to jump 45 centimeters, so 0.45 meters. If both jumps took 1 second for takeoff, which jumper was more powerful? So mass multiplied by 9.81, right? So 80 kilograms multiplied by 9.81, give you your newtons. Okay, and then you got to multiply that by 0.6 because that's the displacement. And then divide by the time is 1 second. So pretty easy on that part. So 80 times 9.81 multiplied by 0.6 should give you 400 something on your watts. What did you get for John on his watts? 470 watts. And then Sam, 100 times 9.81. And then multiply that by 0.45 meters. Divide by 1. Also a very good jump, so 4, close to John. Was it
41.45.
441 watts. So comparing two athletes with different body masses, you can tell which one was more powerful. So John in this case was about 30 watts higher on the power output for that jump. Okay, so do you have any questions? Yes. Work is joules. Yeah, work and energy are joules because work is the transfer of energy. Energy is the capacity to do work. Yeah. Okay, thank you. See you on Wednesday.